for coming today. It's Tuesday, June 9th at 2, and we're continuing with our amazing virtual intensive training sessions with, community, folks doing immigrant rights and immigrant advocacy work here in the Southeast and in Georgia specifically. Today we have Lorelei Williams with the Southern Poverty Law Center, a fierce advocate and litigator for immigrants, and she's going to be talking to us today about a trauma-informed approach to lawyering through a race equity lens, which is very critical to our work and even critical now, more critical now as we all kind of internally and externally reflect on the pervasiveness of white supremacy in our culture. So I'm going to introduce Lorelei and then hand it over to her. If all of you could put yourselves on mute so that there's no, I was not on mute and we heard my husband's cell phone go off. So if you could put yourself on mute. And then we didn't have any sort of like RSVP for these sessions, but I am trying to keep track of who all's attending from where. So if in the chat you could quickly say your name, what organization you're with, or where you go to law school, and maybe even, what city you're in, since folks are teleworking, that would be great. And then I think towards the end, in the last like 15 to 10 minutes, we'll be doing a Q&A. So if you have any questions, I'll be keeping track of the questions in the chat, and we can save some time to ask questions then. So Lorelei Williams is an experienced immigrant advocate dedicated to empowering low-income migrants. Currently, she is a senior staff attorney with the Southern Poverty Law Center's Southern Immigrant Freedom Initiative, where she trains, mentors, and supports her colleagues in the representation of detained migrants at detention centers in Georgia and Louisiana. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Ms. Williams has spearheaded the development of pro se parole resources for detained individuals medically vulnerable to COVID-19. And is working to develop trauma-informed practices for supporting plaintiffs in habeas impact litigation throughout Georgia. Previously, she served as the Director of Immigration and LGBTQ HIV advocacy at Staten Island Legal Services, where she led efforts to engage with the Staten Island Latinx LGBTQ community through a community lawyering model. Ms. Williams was also a founding steering committee member of the Immigrant Active Response Collaborative, the Secretary of the New York chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers Association, or AILA, and on the board of directors for Move Forward Staten Island. She has also engaged in numerous volunteer efforts, including No Ban JFK, the Border Crisis, and the inaugural Immigrant ARC Upstate Lawyer Caravan. Ms. Williams is a graduate of the 2018 Racial Justice Institute cohort by the Sargent Shriver National Center on Poverty Law, and now serves on the RJI Advisory Committee. Building on her prior work with detained immigrant minors, she also continues to actively collaborate with lawyers and the media to expose unjust practices related to minors. She's admitted to the state bars of New York and Texas, and a graduate of Washington University in St. Louis School of Law. So please join me in welcoming Lorelei. We're really, really grateful to have you and have someone with your level of expertise speak with us today. So I'll let you go from there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shelley. Just adding another reminder for folks to mute themselves, and I'm going to start sharing my screen right now. Shelley, can you confirm for me that y'all can see the presentation okay?
Yes, I can see it.
Perfect. Great. So thanks again, everyone, for being here. Shelley described a bit of what we do at CFE at SPLC. SPLC does a combination of things. Impact litigation. We also have non-legal initiatives like Teaching Tolerance, our intelligence project that tracks and monitors hate groups. On the litigation side of things, the SPLC has traditionally been an impact litigation civil rights firm, but CFE, the Southeast Immigrant Freedom Initiative, is our first foray into direct services, where we provide representation to individuals who are detained in their bond and custody cases. So what I'll be talking about with you today is about how to have a trauma-informed approach to lawyering through a race equity lens. I find we don't often talk about this, and it seems particularly important in this moment as more folks understand the importance of supporting Black lives and dismantling white supremacy. I want to be very, very clear, though, that what I'm talking about with you in this short amount of time is like barely scraping the surface. So you should not treat this training as something that has instructed you on how to be a lawyer. You should treat this training as an introduction as to where you need to go to start doing more research and start your own transformation to make sure that you're being the best lawyer that you can be for the clients we serve. So today we have a few learning objectives. We're going to start off talking about how trauma shows up in our work as advocates. We'll also talk about some common language and framework on identity, implicit bias, racism, and structural racialization. And then finally, I'm going to end with a few practical tools that I've used so that might be helpful for you on how to center your clients and your advocacy, making sure that we're always engaging in this in a manner that encourages us to continuously challenge the system by making strategic choices that leverage our collective resources for long-term and meaningful change. So what is trauma? A lot of folks might be familiar with the basic definition of trauma. And what psychological trauma really is a response involving complex debilitation of adaptive abilities. In other words, it ends up interfering with your emotional, cognitive, physical, spiritual, and social aspects of yourself. Again, just a reminder for folks to mute themselves if they're not speaking. And this trauma follows an event that was perceived by our nervous system as life-threatening to ourselves or to others.
I think there's someone
I'm
that's
going to
not
ask
on mute.
folks just one more time to mute themselves.
Yeah, everyone
Thanks.
just take a second, make sure you're on mute because we're hearing some conversations and background noise.
Great, thank you.
All right, thanks. Sorry about that.
Sure. So trauma can show up in a few different ways. It can either be like a super traumatic single one-time event. It can be a prolonged event, one event that maybe lasts for many days or weeks or months, or it could be a series of events. And trauma that affects a community or a country is usually referred to as collective trauma. These traumatic injuries and how we're impacted, how they show up, can be cognitive, emotional, physical, spiritual, social. It's also really important to understand how exactly does trauma affect our brains. When you look at developmental trauma, so this is trauma that happens early in your life, it actually affects your brain development. So it can impact how your brain develops with regard to emotions, cognitive, social abilities. And one thing that's really important to understand is unaddressed developmental trauma can manifest itself in many different ways, right? So it can result in actual psychological diagnoses such as like bipolar disorder, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder. This is really important for advocates to know and understand, especially those of us who work with immigrants and also low-income people, because a lot of times our clients come with developmental trauma that has impacted them and impacts who they are today, especially if it continues to be unaddressed. Post-traumatic stress disorder is something that can also develop from trauma. And what PTSD really is, it's a set of these alarm responses that occur when a survivor's nervous system remains on high alert after trauma in order to protect against further harm. So this alert system, responds to reminders of traumatic memories as a threat. So people can be triggered by certain circumstances, especially if it reminds them of some trauma that they suffered through that might be underlying their PTSD. These additional triggers just add to this growing list of stressors that could affect you when you suffer trauma. The other thing that I want to also really acknowledge right now is that, yes, trauma is going to show up in a lot of the clients we have, particularly in immigration, because a lot of forms of immigration relief require someone to suffer some type of, serious form of trauma before they can be eligible for that form of relief. So it's important for us to understand where our clients are coming from. But also I want to acknowledge that many of us, and increasingly we're seeing more attorneys who reflect the communities that we serve. And so don't forget that you and your colleagues, everyone that you come into contact with, may be survivors of trauma, and that may be affecting their brains and how they bring themselves and show up to certain spaces. When we think about the actual reactions to trauma, and this is what we'll see play out perhaps in our relationships or in our communications with people, we're looking at, things that are, I think, very common to see are confusion, sadness, anxiety, numbness, disassociation. Confusion shows up twice. I'll have to edit that slide. But then also there can be really severe responses, right? Like really severe disassociation that is maybe cycled with periods of relative calm or rest. And all of these responses can be extremely disruptive to one's life and how someone brings themselves to the work. And then you can even have delayed responses to trauma, right? Maybe you don't react immediately to a traumatic event, and maybe it's years later that all of a sudden you have nightmares or you have panic attacks or flashbacks, and that could have been absolutely related to a trigger that happened long ago, but it's just manifesting in your body a little bit later and a little bit differently. The other thing that we need to talk about is specifically how we respond to the exposure of trauma as trauma workers. Because the reality of doing direct services, particularly in immigration for indigent clients, is that we are trauma workers. We see trauma every single day. We ourselves are traumatized by the experiences that we have as attorneys, as legal workers, as advocates. And we have to be mindful about how that exposure to trauma is affecting us, right? So there's this really, really wonderful book. I would highly recommend that everyone read it. It is probably the thing that really helped save my mental health in some really difficult situations. It's called Trauma Stewardship. It's the bottom of the slide, and I'm happy for these slides to be shared out with folks later on as well. But it's a really great book by someone who worked, I believe, as a social worker for a long time in crisis situations, such as like at an ER, at homeless shelters. And she really dug very deep about what does it mean to be a trauma worker, and also what does it mean to build sustainability within our work as trauma workers, right? So she defines the trauma exposure response as the transformation that takes place within us as a result of exposure to the suffering of other living beings on the planet. So this can be accidental exposure. So for example, right now, I would say that we're all exposed to trauma as far as being exposed to the pandemic is concerned and being exposed to the important civil rights movement that's happening right now. But at the same time, we're also here because we're immigration advocates. And so that's a deliberate exposure to trauma that we're creating for ourselves because we're choosing to engage in this work. In order to actually heal from that trauma and continue this work in a sustainable fashion, we have to continuously realize and re-realize that our trauma exposure response is not going to go away unless we actually give it the proper attention. And I'll talk a little bit in the next slide what those signs of the trauma exposure response is. But basically the old adage of like just, suck it up and deal with it and take a break when you need to take a break, that's not enough. In order for us to actually heal in the work and make the work sustainable so that we don't just burn out and quit altogether after 10 years doing this, we really need to confront our trauma directly and figure out how to deal with it directly in the workplace. Step one of that is to really cultivate this awareness about our trauma exposure response. So we need to be able to understand what our needs are and assess what should be done about it as advocates. And by recognizing these shifts where we start experiencing some of these symptoms of the trauma exposure response early on, we can really limit the negative impact that the trauma exposure response can have on our own personal lives. And if you ignore the red flag of a trauma exposure response, that is super dangerous because it's very similar to ignoring like the early rumblings of an avalanche or dismissing the signs for a dangerous cliff up ahead. It's going to happen to you. No one is immune to trauma exposure, whether you like it or not. And and we'll talk a lot about this in a few minutes once we start talking about race, but it is really our duty as folks of privilege, because we do have privilege by being able to have a legal education. We have the privilege of being able to be in that position to help build a movement and support directly impacted people. And we owe it to them to really understand how we're bringing ourselves to the work. When we look at the trauma exposure response, there's kind of 16 clear signs of what the trauma exposure response could look like. One sign is feeling helpless and hopeless, right? So for me, that could be, doing detention work, like the system is fundamentally cruel. And in my habeas cases, the judges gaslights my client's experience all the time. Why am I even doing this if I know I'm going to lose, right? You can feel very helpless and hopeless. You can have a sense that one can never do enough because the demand for our services is always going to exceed the availability of services. Hypervigilance is a very common response. It's one that I and a lot of my colleagues feel a lot of times. We become paranoid, right? Immigration attorneys who've been around now for this entire administration, we now know that Fridays before a long weekend are days to be feared, because that is where we notice the administration making these big policy changes, or being like, oh, hey, we're just going to drop another asylum ban on you on a Friday right before your long weekend, or something to that effect. And so now we're all very hypervigilant about Fridays before long weekends, and we can feel that embodied anxiety. Trauma exposure response also includes diminished creativity, inability to embrace complexity, minimizing is an important one to really kind of discuss, because oftentimes what we end up doing is minimizing our own feelings, right? And so I may say, you know what, even though I had a really rough day and a really rough, week, I'm not going to give my feelings the time and attention they deserve, because what are my feelings in comparison with what my clients are going through? Like, I shouldn't be complaining. That's actually really harmful, because everyone needs to be able to process the trauma that they're exposed to and the trauma that they're going through. And minimizing doesn't do anyone any good. It just helps you bottle it up, but then it might come out in different ways and maybe in different examples of this trauma exposure response. It can also affect you physically, chronic exhaustion, physical ailments. I know for me, for example, I hold my trauma in my body a lot, and it's nearly impossible for me to lose weight. But, when you have a trauma worker who also has a thyroid issue, that trauma is going to interact with those physical ailments, and it's going to impact the body even more. The trauma exposure response can also manifest itself as an inability to listen or maybe deliberate avoidance of certain things. You can also have disassociative moments, sense of persecution, guilt, right? We have guilt that we're the ones who are able to be here and relatively free and have like the privilege of citizenship maybe, and feeling guilty that our clients do not have those privileges. Can have fear, anger, and cynicism is really common. And also an inability to empathize or numbing. Like if you find yourself over time not being able to empathize with your client and what they're going through, you feel numb to the pain that they're going through. I know that that's happened to me a lot. I started my career working with a lot of domestic violence survivors, and there would be cases where I'll be like, oh, well, yeah, sure, that was DV, but that was like the normal level of DV, whereas like this level of DV, that's kind of crazy. But that shows how I wasn't really open or able to empathize with what I was dismissing as kind of regular DV, which can be just as traumatic as any other form of DV, right? Trauma exposure response can also manifest itself as addictions. and also grandiosity, right? Where we end up having such an inflated sense of importance relating to our work, like we are the crusaders, we are the ones who are coming in and saving our clients from ICE. You know, that's not our role. That's not who we are. And there's a lot of also kind of race impacts and consequences from having that sense of grandiosity. So we're going to shift a little bit to talk about race, and then towards the end, I'll bring it all together. And what we need to understand about race is that race is really a social construct or idea that's been built over time. It continues to evolve and change, but it still has very concrete ramifications for people's lives. And there are many interconnecting sides or facets to race. What I really love about how the Schreiber Center kind of added to this definition is the process of racialization is one way that our society sorts communities and people to allocate resources and access to resources. And you can see that very evidently on race lines, right? So we are going to allocate education resources, for example, to richer white neighborhoods and not give those same resources to poor redlined Black neighborhoods, right? We see that happening, and it's really fascinating to me, and it makes me think of it in different ways when I think about racialization as a way of allocating resources and access to resources and also denying it. A couple of definitions that I want to go through real quick, and I also want to be very mindful if this feels like a lot for you, then that means you have a lot of homework to do. I'm going through a lot of really complex topics really, really quickly because I have a goal of tying some of this together by the end of the hour, but this is just my reminder that if some of this feels new or foreign to you, you really, really, really got to step up and do some more research and homework on your own. When we talk about structural racism, we're talking about an actual structural system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. When we talk about racial justice, we're talking about the systemic fair treatment of all people that results in equitable opportunities and outcomes for everyone. When we talk about racial equity, we're talking about the state of being within a society that occurs when we cannot predict group advantage or disadvantage by race or ethnicity. We have to be mindful that diversity is not the same thing as equity. Diversity is variety, but equity is fairness. You can have diversity without equity. Diversity, it's very important to understand, is not the end goal, but rather it's a means to move towards equity. Diversity is also not the same thing as inclusion. Diversity can be merely quantitative representation, whereas inclusion involves qualitative participation. Because tokenism, for example, could happen with diversity, but it shouldn't be happening when there's inclusion. And then finally, equality is not the same as equity. Equality, we're talking about sameness. Everyone gets the same thing. Equity is fairness. And sometimes equity really means differentiated treatment based on different needs in order to arrive at equal outcomes. So the focus is on outcomes. When we look at racism a little bit more in depth, we can also create a framework for understanding 4 different levels of racism. We can think about racism almost kind of divided on 2 levels first, an individual level versus a systemic level, and then further divided on those levels. So on the individual level, we're talking about internalized racism or internalized oppression that lies within individuals. So that are your internal beliefs, the things that influence the decisions that you make. When we talk about interpersonal racism on the individual level, this occurs between individuals. And this is maybe the most common definition of racism that we think about when we think about the word racist, right? For like, if we think about, okay, what's an example of a racist person? That is what we're thinking about, right? We're thinking about that interpersonal racism that happens between people where one person is explicitly racist against another. But it's very, very important to actually focus on the systemic level of racism. And we have 2 different levels within the systemic level. We have institutional racism, which occurs within institutions and systems of power So this might be racism, for example, that exists within a housing authority and how they treat people who seek benefits through that housing authority. And then structural racism occurs when there is racial bias among institutions and across society. So that might be like, for example, how the housing authority, the education system, and the criminal justice system all interact in order to produce inequitable outcomes on the basis of race. The other piece about racism that is always important to acknowledge and keep in mind is that of implicit bias. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. They can be favorable or unfavorable. They can be voluntary, they can be involuntary. You can be aware of it, you can be unaware of it. A few very important pieces about implicit bias. First, they're pervasive. Everyone has implicit bias. I have implicit bias, you have implicit bias, we all have implicit bias. Second, implicit and explicit biases, they're related, but they're distinct mental constructs. They're not mutually exclusive, and sometimes they reinforce each other. So someone who is overtly racist is also going to have implicit biases, and that could be that those two things interact with each other, right? But the other thing to remember is that implicit biases do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs or beliefs that we think that we have that we specifically endorse. And this happens to us a lot. So for example, right now, there's a lot of debates and conversations about defunding police and how we're implicit, and I think that brings up a lot of implicit biases issues, right? Because on one hand, we may be saying overtly, yes, support people of color, let people of color lead. But if we are then engaging in a semantic argument about whether defund police or abolish ICE should be the right strategies because maybe on a semantic level they might be too radical and maybe there'll be political consequences, that is maybe a way about how some implicit biases about how we present ourselves in our work, and are we truly letting people of color lead some of these conversations? And we might not be if we ask ourselves about our own implicit biases. We do tend to hold implicit biases that favor our own in-group, but that is not always the case. Internalized oppression is very real. And implicit biases are also malleable. So they do change over time, and we can also actually make the effort to unlearn them through a variety of debiasing techniques. And I would really encourage you to do more research about this and think about how implicit bias affects you. And then finally, with regard to race specifically, I wanted to talk about racial trauma. If you are someone who is white, you need to step back and really kind of listen and understand how you might be presenting yourself in these conversations, and understand that there is this whole world of racial trauma that people of color around you have experienced and continue to experience that you will never fully understand because you will not experience it. Racial trauma refers to the events of danger related to real or perceived experience of racial discrimination. These can include threats of harm and injury, humiliating, shaming events, and witnessing harm to other people of color due to real or perceived racism. And we also have to understand that, on top of this racial trauma also exists intersectional oppression, right? So you may feel some forms of oppression that may allow you to empathize a bit more with people of color. For example, if you, have a sexual orientation that is not heterosexual and is not the majority, I guess I should say. If you have a gender that is not the majority, right, you may suffer intersectional oppression in different ways. And it's important to understand that these intersectional forms of oppression, particularly for people of color, can really contribute to a very cumulative effect of racial trauma. And this racism and ethno-violence can be life-threatening to people of color due to their exposure to these microaggressions, vicarious traumatization, the invisibility of racial trauma's historical roots. Now, I want to talk about how we can, what does this all mean? What does it mean to talk about race and trauma, and how does that inform how I show up into conversations? And so this has been a very helpful tool for me to think about that was done by the Impact of Consulting Group for SPLC. They have these workshops called Self and Systems. And basically what we want to understand is what are our power up and our power down identities, right? When you have a power up identity, that's a facet of your identity where you hold privilege that might be systemically denied to others. So an example of a power up identity is if you're white, that aspect of your identity is a power up, male, cisgender, heterosexual, able, wealthy, higher education, but also in the workplace, if you're a supervisor or senior to someone or an attorney, right, versus a non-attorney. And then power down identities are those facets where you are denied access to opportunities on a structural and systemic level. So this could be like if you're a person of color, if you're gender nonconforming or transgender, female, queer, disabled, poor, less formal education, supervisee, junior, if you're the client, right? All of those are power down identities when you're in space with someone that has that power up identity. And these power identities, they lie on a spectrum. So someone can have both a power up and a power down identity relative to others' power identity. So for example, using me here as an example, I'm a cisgender Asian American queer woman. And if I'm interacting with someone who is a cisgender heterosexual white male, I absolutely have the power down identity. He holds power over me within the structural framework that we have about how we class people, right? When I'm interacting, though, with someone who might be Black, gender nonconforming, queer, then I have a power up identity, and the responsibility I hold within that space is different because I'm not the most vulnerable person. I don't have the power down identities within that space when I'm with that person. And when we think about these power up and power down identities, that's what can lead us to think more clearly about what our intent is versus what our impact is. A lot of times when we have a power up identity, we only care about our intent, but I meant well. I didn't mean the super racist outcome because I totally meant well. And that's not okay. And that's why it's important to understand a power up identity versus a power down identity. And this also shows up in our legal work, right? So if we're representing a bunch of clients, very crazy, overwhelming litigation, maybe it's moving really fast and we're just so focused on legal strategy because we know that that's what's going to get us the best shot at winning. But then we totally fail to actually maintain a good relationship with our client. We fail to maintain good communication with our client. Our client may feel extremely traumatized by that relationship that they have with us because they may feel even more ignored, even more disempowered within this situation that's directly impacting their lives. So when we hold a power up identity, we have to be really mindful about the impact of what we say and what we don't say, and what we do and what we don't do. And being mindful about impact is really what's going to help you build rapport and trust with your colleagues. I mean, honestly, like all aspects of your life and including your clients. And that's going to lead to clear communication and more meaningful outcomes. Leaving the slide here just for a second, one thing that's really important is that we need to be curious and open about how white privilege, saviorism, and fragility show up in our work. We really should try to seek to learn more, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and we have to be willing to lean into that discomfort because we've all grown up in a society where white supremacy has reigned as king supreme alongside capitalism. And if we're really going to try to participate in meaningful transformation that impacts the directly impacted communities, communities of color and migrant communities, then we need to be able to check our privilege and see how we actually fit into that space by empowering and supporting the directly impacted people. So just a few links that you can look into if you maybe are newer to understanding white privilege, white saviorism, and white fragility. So I would really advise that you do some extra homework on that. And even if you might be a person of color, because we also do have our own internalized oppression. And even if we are a person of color and have suffered a lot of systemic and structural racism ourselves, at the end of the day, we're also legal advocates, and we have a privilege that our clients don't. So being curious about this privilege can help us, even if you are not white. And one thing I want to be very clear is when we talk about white privilege, white saviorism, and white fragility, you don't have to be white to necessarily have some of that show up in yourself, right? We're talking, the reason why we use the adjective white is because these issues stem directly from white supremacy and how pervasive it is within our structures and systems. So now, okay, that was a lot, and you're just an intern, and what are you supposed to do with all that information, right? So here's a few practical tips about how to actually embody some of this work and start letting it affect how you engage in the work. One, we need to first accept that we are all still learning together. I am still learning. I am not here as a teacher. I am here as a fellow student of trauma and race equity and lawyering, and I am sharing with you what I learn. I make mistakes. We all make mistakes, but that's okay. The hallmark, I think, of a great advocate is someone who's willing to lean into things that are uncomfortable and actually be willing to work through it to try to be a better lawyer. We also need to be very mindful and intentional about improving our communication skills. We have to learn to communicate effectively across differences to improve our relationships with our clients and our colleagues. We also have to be protective of our capacity and mental health. I say this as someone who has spent time on the border getting tear gassed, who has spent time in detention centers. Y'all, I have PTSD. I am very traumatized by this work. But I'm not willing to quit it, and I want to use my trauma as a means of instructing me at how I can better show up to the work. So in order to do that, I have to be protective of my own capacity and mental health. We also have to be strategic. Be strategic about how you're accomplishing your goals. A lot of times, well-intentioned advocates can contribute to their clients' re-traumatization, and you may never see it if you don't have those communication relationships with your clients. And I don't think any one of us ever intends to leave our clients in harm. And then finally, and this is the most important thing that I would urge you to remember always, if there's one thing that you need to take away from this training, is that you really need to center your client's humanity in all that you do. Be very strategic about how you're going to leverage your opportunities to contribute to structural and systemic change, and let their humanity be the driving force behind your strategy. As far as communication tips are concerned, there's a few tips. One, make sure to use common language. Don't use jargon, legalese, don't use idioms. Oh my God, it drives me up the wall when people use sports metaphors. I didn't grow up in the US and I know nothing about sports, and it's very alienating. So I usually have no idea what people are talking about. So make sure to use common language as well with your clients. Be very mindful of avoiding patronizing, condescending, and distancing language. This happens quite often. You need to actually take the time to validate your client's experience, but you can do it while also explaining very realistically how their experience fits into the legal framework. Remember, again, the impact of what and how you speak to your client, and make sure, and you have to remember that that impact is going to overshadow your intent. The impact is really what matters. And then finally, it's really important to remember that everyone's overwhelmed. Y'all are the first class of interns to start internships in the middle of the pandemic. Congratulations at being pioneers. But remember that everything is overwhelming for you. Everything's overwhelming for your families, for your friends, for your colleagues, for your clients, everyone. So just make sure that you're being kind and generous and forgiving. And you know, you're going to get that right back from your colleagues and the people who you interact with. Few tips for actual active listening skills is these all came from the Center for Creative Leadership. And so first, you want to really pay attention to what the person is telling you. Allow for pauses, process what they're talking about. Pay attention to the nonverbal communication and make sure you're always operating from a place of respect. As you're paying attention to what they're saying, make sure you withhold judgment. Don't speak out judgments, criticisms. Don't argue or try to sell something to the person who you're talking to. Just withhold judgment for a moment. Then you're going to want to reflect. So always assume that you don't know 100% what's going on. Assume that there might have been something that you might have missed, right? So create that opportunity to reflect their points by paraphrasing it back to them to make sure that you're understanding each other clearly. Clarify. Make sure to ask questions that clarify what you're trying to understand. Make sure your questions are open-ended, clarifying, probing, and you'll be able to understand a little bit better where the person you're speaking to is coming from. Summarize what they're saying. Make sure that you summarize their key themes and what they're talking about at the end. You know, for me, a lot of times that also looks like, you know, summarizing the detention center conditions that my client told me about in a meeting. Hey, I want to make sure that I got all of this right. Let me repeat it back to you. Is this correct? And then share. So as you gain a better understanding of the person that you're speaking to, make sure that you share an appropriate reaction or how you'll be using this information. And so that could be, you know, me doing something as simple and as humane as just saying, hey, I'm really sorry for how that went through. And I'm really sorry how that impacted you. Yes, you're right. Like, that wasn't fair. And then also sharing, what am I going to do with that information? So oftentimes when clients will tell me, hey, here's this detail about detention center conditions, I can tell them, oh, you know what? That's actually really important for a habeas litigation. It fits into our strategy in X, Y, and Z ways. Thank you for sharing that with me. And then again, this final step about sharing is oftentimes ignored by advocates, but it's such an important opportunity to really center your client's humanity in your advocacy. You also want to make sure that you set very clear expectations and boundaries with your clients. So I'll give you an example here. Is I have a client who is Tamil, monolingual speaker, has a lot of anxiety. His immigration case lost, BIA appeal dismissed. The window for a petition for review in federal court is passed. There could be some creative, unique strategies that could be used, but I don't have them. I'm the habeas attorney in this role. I am not his immigration lawyer. And then we end up being really frustrated in all of our conversations because he was calling me so often. I'm pretty sure there was at least 1 week where I talked to him for like 10 hours. It was just really overwhelming, and we both got really frustrated. And that also had an impact on my mental health. And so what we did to make the relationship better for both of us, we have regularly scheduled appointments, and we clearly define what constitutes an emergency that warrants an after-hours call. I described it as if someone is really hurt or dying. That is when you call me for an emergency. But in every situation, in every relationship with the client, different emergencies can occur. We always request the same interpreter because there's one interpreter in particular who the client understands really well, makes a really good effort of making sure to explain everything in detail. I make sure to provide very clear and detailed updates on litigation so that way he doesn't have anxiety about, hey, what are all these crazy lawyers doing for me, and they don't tell me what's going on. I also, try to seek help for the things that I can't help with. So looking for a referral for his immigration matter. I'll tell him like, hey, this is what I did to try to help you find an attorney. Again, I can't get into depth with this conversation with you because I'm not going to be your immigration attorney. This is my role for the habeas litigation. Let me reaffirm my role. And then whenever there are any tensions that arise in communication, we address them directly and in a timely manner. I distinctly remember a conversation where I was explaining again my role as the habeas attorney and that I couldn't answer all of his questions about his immigration case. And he said, you know what? I understand your role, my role. This is my life, and I'm scared of dying, so I'm going to continue advocating. And I'm like, okay, that's your right. Like, you deserve to do that. as long as you understand that I may continue saying, no, I can't help you with that. And that actually improved our relationship a great deal by being able to talk about that directly instead of letting it kind of fester passively. You also want to be strategic about how you do your work and what does it mean to really center your client's humanity. And as you are being strategic and thinking about your work, you always need to constantly evaluate and reevaluate what strategies you're employing. Because even if something may work this month, that might not be a strategy that works next month, particularly when we're in a time like this, like in a pandemic. And so for me, kind of going back to this habeas litigation, the litigation itself is crazy fast-paced, super unpredictable. We get gaslighted by the judge all the time. We have limited access to facts. It's just an incredibly messed up situation. ICE lies to everybody. The wardens lie to everybody. It's frustrating. Clients were calling me at first at all hours every day. I became so overwhelmed. And so what I did was I began scheduling weekly appointments with my clients. And so every week I have about 6 to 8 appointments that I have with my clients. And I told my clients directly, I'm like, hey, listen, I'm getting a little overwhelmed with everything. And so I'd like to schedule a weekly appointment with you so that way you can have an expectation that you're going to speak with me. I'll be able to give you an update on the case, but also you'll be able to give me update on the facts, and we'll be able to work together in a more predictable fashion because this is a little difficult for me to handle right now. And that clear, direct communication really helped my clients to develop trust in me because I was showing up with them every single week. And in most situations, attorneys don't show up for their clients on a predictable, kind of stable timeline, right? Those weekly appointments also gave us enough time to really talk about everything that we needed to talk about. So usually within, 40, 45, 50 minutes, we can talk about both litigation updates and I can get updates from them on detention center conditions. And then that gives me a spare 5, 10, 15 minutes where we can just be human together and ask each other, hey, how was your weekend? Or, hey, you've been watching the news. How are you doing? How are the protests impacting you? How is your family? And that allows us to continue developing this trust and rapport that makes it so much easier for us to work together. And this intentional, respectful relationship building really helps ensure that the client is centered in our advocacy, gives the client opportunities to ask questions and provide feedback in real time. And then finally, it creates boundaries and stability for the advocate. And then finally, a couple of things on centering your client. One thing that I have to underscore that I don't think a lot of attorneys understand, your clients are your equals. You are not a better or more important human being than the client you serve. They may sometimes lack that legal knowledge, but they know what it's like to be subject to the cruelty and racism of our immigration systems. You need to provide space for your clients to discuss the broader structural racialization of the circumstances that they're subject to, but also be very mindful of your power-up identity. Let your clients lead any deeper discussions on anything outside of that legal matter you are working on with them. Because one thing that well-intentioned advocates may do, they may say, oh, well, I heard in this training that I need to, focus on structural racism, and so let me talk about this with my client and see what happens, That oftentimes doesn't always stem from a place of this is a space I'm sharing with my client, I'm letting them lead and I'm letting them own that space versus maybe you wanting to unload something you learned or felt, and then you end up burdening your client with your own privilege. That's why I can't underscore enough that any conversations that you have on this, you really have to let your clients lead those deeper discussions, and they will happen if you actually develop that intentional strategic relationship with your clients. And then all of that is going to lead to you being creative with your advocacy, right? Don't just think about the traditional legal matter that's before you. What are the challenges? Like really ask yourself, what are the challenges, the changes that you want to see for your client and their communities to be treated in a just and equitable manner? What are the changes they want to see, right? What are they asking for? And even if your work is limited, is there anyone else that they should be connected to? Should they be connected to a grassroots organization, a community health center, elected official, media, other nonprofits, anything like that? And see what you can do to try to instigate some change that is more meaningful and impactful. And then again, as I had mentioned at the beginning, this is really designed to be like an intro course. I don't want you to think that you really learned anything in this training other than this is the homework that I need to do. And so here I have some links to some things about next steps. And what we really need for next steps is, one, we need a commitment from each and every single one of you to learn more about community lawyering, trauma-informed approaches to advocacy, race equity, abolition, and Black history. Lean into that discomfort of growth. Leverage that growth then to be a more strategic and effective advocate. We have a training that I did a few weeks ago on a trauma-informed approach to working with clients remotely that really focuses, again, a little bit more deeply on how to develop these conversations with your clients. And then DW1 and the Latinx Therapist Action Network did an amazing series on trauma and vicarious trauma. And then I have some links also to anti-racist reading lists and a law and social justice reading list. So thank you for listening to my intro, and I will stop share screen now and open it up for any questions.
Yeah, so if folks want to put their questions in chat or go off mute and ask Lorelai some questions yourself, that would be great. Yeah, let's see. Well,
list of resources.
Yeah, so I have the PowerPoint. So Jeff is an intern in our office. I can definitely share, and then I can, if folks want to reach out to me or Lorelai, here's my email address. I'm happy to share. Just make sure that you give credit to Lorelai for the materials if you ever share it with folks.
And I'll also add my email address to the chat.
No, but this is just so timely, Lorelai, your presentation, because, you know, we're in this moment of, it's an amazing moment, but a very painful moment, obviously, of racial justice and reckoning, and like, you know, corporations saying Black Lives Matter, Mitt Romney saying Black Lives Matter, but as social justice organizations like Southern Poverty Law Center, Tahare, like all of us are having to do the internal work as well. And so a lot of what you're discussing kind of resonates with me in terms of kind of some of the internal discussions we're having around privilege, about amplifying voices of people of color in our organization, and then looking at our client population and making sure that, you know, that hierarchy doesn't exist. On Monday, we spoke with Priyanka Bhatt from Project South and Adelina Nichols from GLAR, and we talked about community lawyering. And as attorneys, there's definitely an elitism in our culture and hierarchy and kind of savior complexes. So I really appreciate kind of you going in depth, going into that today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the main thing that I want to also say, since we have interns specifically as the audience, is that I can guarantee you that no one's doing it right. So if you see something and you don't think it's being done right, and you see a negative impact from some type of pattern or practice that's happening, I'd encourage you to explore that as much as possible. And I realize, given the power dynamics too, that as interns, you hold the power down identity with any of your colleagues that you work with. But it can at least be a moment for you to reflect and think about, when you finally graduate and pass the bar and join our ranks, how are you going to do it different? How are you going to do it better? Because no one's doing it perfect. There's certainly a lot of people doing a lot of really cool things, but just most direct services organizations have been at a lot now. I can guarantee you there is just so much room to grow.
Absolutely. Did anyone else want to ask Lorelai any questions about what she presented on or any of the materials or resources?
Hi.
Hi.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi. Okay, yeah. So this was such an amazing presentation. Thank you so much. It was so like well done, and I've learned so much through just this 1 hour. And it definitely will look into all those resources that you left us. I had a quick question about uh, I forgot the name of it exactly, but it's sort of like trauma that you inherit from your family. So it's like your mother went through trauma, you kind of inherit the trauma yourself. Not 100% sure the name of it, but we discussed it a little bit when when I was working over the past year with individuals on death row, and kind of trying to create a narrative for their life and looking into their parents' history just to kind of understand the trauma that they also inherited. So I was wondering if like that was also something that we did talk about different forms of trauma, and I was wondering if that was something that you've had experience with or that you've seen in your own clients, and how we could possibly like be able to recognize those traumas, and how we can sort of, I guess, deal with those traumas when it comes to our clients and be able to be aware of it and treat them accordingly.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Generational trauma is absolutely a part of the conversation as well. And for me, I guess what I don't necessarily do is I don't necessarily change my strategies depending on the type of trauma that's showing up, right? Like, it's not like I think, oh, well, this one specifically is generational trauma versus this one specifically is racial trauma, and am I going to have a different strategy for either one of them? I think at the end of the day, the strategies end up being quite similar, because one thing to also remember is that our understanding of trauma, from a scientific, medical, psychological, spiritual analysis, is honestly still within early stages of development. I feel like there is so much more that we don't understand about trauma, how it interacts with each other, how it impacts us. But what we can do is we can learn more about the causes of trauma and then be understanding when we see the impacts of trauma play out, right? So for me, it's like if I have a really difficult client who maybe is combative with me and doesn't show up to appointments, anything like that, that would prompt me to wonder, hey, is this person coming from a place of trauma first, right? So I can observe it through that lens. And I think generational trauma is also kind of a part of that questioning, right? And me thinking about it. And then it's okay, if this is like the symptom of the trauma is how combative they are with me, that they're not showing up to appointments and other things, what can I do to kind of help get us to where we need to in order to work effectively together while still providing space and understanding for that trauma? So for me, it might look like, well, for that specific client, maybe what I need is I need to schedule a phone check-in every single week at a specific time, so that way they know that I am still paying attention to them, because maybe that anger, that frustration is coming from, oh, well, the system's screwing me over, my attorney's not helping me, they haven't won my case yet, I still don't have a decision, what are they even doing? So by having that constant check-in, they're validated and they feel valued and important in this case, that it impacts their lives. So I think, at the end of the day, I don't spend as much time trying to piecing out the different types of trauma. I do think that it is worth more exploration, direct trauma versus trauma as trauma workers, because how we are affected by trauma ourselves as trauma workers is different than direct trauma. And at the end of the day, that should always just inform how we formulate our strategies. And our strategies always need to be tailored. They need to be evaluated. They need to be reevaluated as we engage in this work with our clients.
Thanks for that question. Does anyone else have a final question? We have like 1 more minute. All right. Well, Lorelei, thank you again. This was a great presentation. I'm actually going to make sure I share. Hopefully, we're going to have all the recordings up on a YouTube channel for Tahereh, but especially in this moment of where race equity is at the forefront. I think it's important that my colleagues see this as well. So thank you for that. Folks on that attended, we have some great trainings coming up the rest of this week and on Monday. So tomorrow afternoon, I think at 2 o'clock, Gain is going to be doing a presentation, a thorough presentation on U&T visas and asylum. So please be sure to tune into that. We have two kind of experts in doing those forms of relief for immigrant survivors. So looking forward to that. And Lorelei, thank you again for putting this presentation and making the time for us today.